Well, hello. Welcome back to another exciting edition of Coffee with Stephen. So, this week's blog is entitled January 6th. Last week, we were subjected to an entire media frenzy pontificating about the darkest day on American soil. Vice President of the United States said that there are 3 days that are so fundamentally ingrained into America's national character because of the tragedies that had occurred. December 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001, and of course, January 6th, 2021. The Great Insurrection. On Facebook, some of my more liberal friends were talking about how this was the Great Insurrection Day. The level of violence was just palpable, and you could see how this armed insurrectionist group, heavily coordinated, made their way to the Capitol with the intent of subverting the American system. Poppycock. I mean, the whole thing is just utter crap, okay? First of all, we have, based on the nomenclature that's been established by the left preceding the election, the new statement, mostly peaceful protest. We saw massive levels of insurrection taking place throughout the United States as we ran up towards the election. We saw it most ardently being taken place in Portland, where there were actual armed attacks on the institution of government. These were labeled as using their vernacular, mostly peaceful protests. Of course, there were a couple of ne'er-do-wells that let their emotions run amok and they decided to burn down the whole goddamn city. But, for the most part, people were generally well behaved. Well, using the same kind of logic, that's exactly what took place on the Mall leading up to the certification of the election. President Trump had a rally. There were a boatload of people that were there, and some individuals decided to go to the Capitol. Some of those individuals absolutely were intent on trying to prevent the certification of the election. There's no question about that. However, not all. In fact, actually a huge chunk of the people that actually made their way into the Capitol made their way into the Capitol because people were walking into the Capitol. And there were a bunch of police guards that were effectively allowing people in. They weren't stopping anybody or anything like that. In fact, the only real violence that occurred took place against the protesters. Now, the president and the vice president have said that this is the darkest day in American history, that nothing like this had ever occurred. That is what we call a lie, okay? This has happened many times before, and actually in a much greater egregious manner. There's been bombings of the Senate building. Bombings, okay? There were an entire militia that showed up on the Mall that MacArthur and Patton and Eisenhower actually had to put down at the end of World War I. We've saw a goddamn civil war occur between the states. I mean, there has been massive levels of violence that have occurred when our political system has either fundamentally broken down or alternatively when groups of people have largely been ignored. And yes, sometimes violence actually does result, although most of the time it's violence on the part of the state against those that are mostly peacefully protesting. What is interesting, though, is listening to the left talk about January 6th. And I've mentioned this before. They talk about the government in religious terms, the temple of democracy. This incredibly sort of flowery speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned this in the blog, but I want you to kind of wrap your brain around this, okay? While I am definitely a patriot, and while I get sort of misty-eyed when I look at Old Glory, and I feel a discernible amount of personal respect when I stand in the Capitol Rotunda, This is nothing more than the DMV with better architecture, okay? That's all it is. It's a government building. It doesn't do anything unique. In fact, if anything, the entire concept of the government, our government, as opposed to other authoritarian ones, is designed to limit the amount of control that this governmental institution can have over people. That certainly hasn't been the case, but the left has taken religion, tried to marginalize it as much as humanly possible, and instead elevate the state to an almost religious ideology. Now, this is consistent with authoritarianism. We see this consistently throughout the world. And one of the things that I've argued is that the United States has, in fact, become an authoritarian regime. There's been there was a lot of discussion during the Trump administration and how he was an authoritarian. I don't think actually made the mark. He was aggressive. There's no question about that. But he actually spent a tremendous amount of time dismantling the state, completely contrary to authoritarian ideals. This administration has absolutely embraced massive expansion of the state, massive expansion on how we think, and using force in order to compel behavioral ideals. Okay? The idea that a human being is uniquely independent and that human being and that his ideas or her views are somehow protected is completely gone. Now the way you think is legitimately in question. We've seen it with big tech and the way they control the messaging. We see that now with the left in power and how they control government. I am typically very concerned when I see this type of thing manifest in any sort of governmental group throughout the world. Okay, the one thing that we have going for us right now is that the current administration is absolutely mind-bogglingly incompetent. They stink at their job. That is the one thing that we actually have working for us right now. Unfortunately, they are building the architecture. And when we have another administration, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat or even a third party, we have another administration, now those architectural controls are in place and they can be used against us. So it's something to think about. Anyways, read the blog. I hope you enjoy it. While we still have our individual liberties, I encourage you to train constantly, train consistently, or train repetitively, and train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.